Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today, we are diving into one of the most important but overlooked forces shaping modern life, the evolution of housing markets. You might think of your home as just four walls and a roof, but behind every street, every neighborhood, and every real estate transaction, there is a deeper story about freedom, incentives, and unintended consequences. Let me ask you this: what happens when housing is treated like a personal achievement rather than a political right? And how did we drift so far from that idea? In the early days, housing markets operated through something beautifully simple: decentralized allocation. That is, no central authority told you where you could live, how much you could pay, or whether you deserved a home. Instead, people engaged in private, voluntary exchanges. Buyers and sellers met in open markets, negotiated freely, and adjusted to supply and demand naturally, like breathing. At the heart of this system was something invisible but powerful: price signals. Prices were not just numbers, they were messages. A rising price whispered that housing was scarce and valuable. A falling price signaled that supply was plentiful or demand was weaker. These signals, when left undisturbed, drove innovation. Builders created more homes where they were needed most. People adapted, cities evolved, and communities thrived without a bureaucrat standing over them with a clipboard. And perhaps most importantly, home ownership was seen as a personal achievement. It was something to aspire to, a milestone earned through hard work and savings. Nobody assumed it was a right handed out by politicians. Instead, it symbolized personal responsibility, stability, and pride. Think about that for a second. How different would the world look today if that view had stayed intact? Alright, with that foundation in mind, let's move forward to see what happens when well-meaning hands start tugging at the strings. As we move forward, the story takes a sharp turn. The Great Depression shook America to its core, and with it came a new philosophy that government could and should step in to manage economic life, including housing. And thus began the era of intervention. One of the first big players was the Federal Housing Administration, or FHA. On paper, the goal sounded noble: stabilize the housing market and help Americans afford homes. But behind the polished language, FHA standards baked something much darker into the system: redlining. Maps were drawn, and entire neighborhoods were color-coded based on perceived risk. But that so-called risk often had nothing to do with financial realities and everything to do with race and ethnicity. Communities were labeled hazardous simply because of the people who lived there. Loans dried up, investment vanished, discrimination, once unofficial, became codified in underwriting manuals. Then came the post-war era. Veterans returned from World War II by the millions, and the government, again with the best of intentions, created the VA loan program. Home ownership exploded among returning soldiers if, that is, you fit the preferred profile. Minority groups were often locked out, as zoning laws carved cities into segregated zones and reinforced barriers that had been quietly built years earlier. Urban renewal projects added another layer. City planners envisioned gleaming new housing blocks and clean, modern neighborhoods. But in reality, many of these projects bulldozed thriving communities, displacing families and destroying social networks that had taken generations to build. Even worse, these well-meaning interventions distorted market incentives. Private investment shrank, bureaucratic control grew, and the organic life of neighborhoods was replaced by gray, soulless uniformity. So here is the real question: when government intervention tries to fix a market by overriding natural signals and voluntary decisions, what do we lose along the way? Hold that thought, because in the next chapter, the consequences grow even more visible. By the time the 1970s rolled around, the distortions were no longer just hidden beneath the surface. They were breaking through in painful, undeniable ways. Cities like New York and San Francisco, facing inflation spikes and growing public pressure, decided to freeze rents. It sounded like a quick fix. After all, who would oppose making housing more affordable, right? But here's the thing about rent ceilings: they are a bit like putting a lid on a boiling pot. Sure, it keeps the steam down for a while, but the pressure underneath only builds. Landlords, now forced to operate at artificially low prices, found little reason to maintain their properties. Why repair a leaking roof or fix the broken stairs if you are forbidden from charging a rent that reflects your costs? Maintenance collapsed. Buildings decayed. Entire neighborhoods started to rot from the inside out. Many landlords simply walked away, exiting the market altogether. Others looked for ways around the system, fueling the growth of black markets in housing. Meanwhile, new construction dried up, because why would anyone invest in new apartments if the price they could charge was set by a distant bureaucrat rather than by actual demand? At its core, rent control distorted the most basic incentives that make any market function. It replaced voluntary, price-driven solutions with centralized mandates. And the result was not stability, it was urban decay. The very cities that tried to protect tenants ended up driving them into crumbling, neglected homes with fewer and fewer options. It is a vivid lesson: when the natural signals of a market are silenced, chaos does not disappear, it only moves underground. And sadly, this was just the beginning of deeper cracks forming beneath the surface. Let's keep going. As we step into the 1990s and early 2000s, a new idea took hold, one that would quietly plant the seeds for an even greater disaster. The dream of universal home ownership became a national obsession. Politicians, banks, and even everyday citizens embraced the belief that almost anyone should be able to own a home, no matter their financial situation. And to make that dream possible, lending standards were dramatically relaxed. Easier credit flooded the market. No-document loans became common, meaning you could get a mortgage without even proving your income. Underwriting thresholds fell through the floor. At the heart of this expansion were government-sponsored entities like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. These giants fueled the fire by dramatically increasing exposure to subprime and risky mortgages. Banks had every reason to issue loans to questionable borrowers because they knew those loans could be bundled up and sold off to investors, often with a government guarantee smoothing over the risks. But underneath all the optimism, a dangerous disconnect was growing. Mortgage debt ballooned faster than wages. Home prices skyrocketed beyond what ordinary people could afford. The fundamentals, like income growth, savings, and stable employment, were shoved aside, replaced by speculation and government-backed hope. The entire housing system started to drift into fantasyland, propped up by easy credit and political promises rather than real, sustainable value. It was a classic case of good intentions blinding everyone to the risks that were quietly building up beneath their feet. And those risks? They would not stay hidden forever. Let's move into the next chapter, where all of these pressures finally explode. And then, it all came crashing down. In 2008, the housing market, this massive tower built on shaky foundations, collapsed in spectacular fashion. It was not just a few bad loans going sour. It was a total system failure, triggered by years of intervention, distortion, and moral hazard finally catching up to reality. Home prices that everyone believed could only go up suddenly plunged. Millions of Americans found themselves underwater, owing more on their mortgages than their homes were worth. Foreclosures swept across the country like wildfire. Banks that had once boasted about record profits now faced record losses, and many simply failed outright. The government scrambled to intervene once again, this time with bailouts and emergency programs. But these were not true solutions. They were frantic efforts to patch holes in a sinking ship. At the core of the meltdown was a simple truth: when market forces are replaced by political mandates and artificial incentives, reality will eventually assert itself. No matter how many subsidies, guarantees, or price supports are layered into the system, fundamentals like affordability, risk, and supply and demand cannot be ignored forever. The 2008 crisis did not appear out of nowhere. It was the logical endgame of decades of tampering with the most basic signals that once kept the housing market healthy. And while the immediate wreckage was devastating, the deeper issues, the ones beneath the surface, would prove even more troubling. Let's dig deeper into the hidden forces that made this disaster not just possible, but inevitable. Now we reach one of the most important and least understood parts of this whole story: moral hazard. When governments, banks, and institutions step in to shield people and businesses from the consequences of risky behavior, they do not eliminate the risk, they amplify it. Think about it like this: if you knew you could gamble in a casino and keep all your winnings, but if you lost, someone else would cover your losses, how carefully would you bet? Probably not very carefully at all. That is exactly what happened in the years leading up to the housing crash. Banks made risky loans, knowing they could sell them off. Investors bought risky securities, knowing they were backed by government guarantees. Borrowers took on more debt than they could possibly handle, convinced that rising home prices would bail them out. The safety nets created during the New Deal and expanded through the following decades created a psychological shield. People believed someone else, whether it was the government, the banks, or the taxpayers, would step in if things went wrong. And when enough people start ignoring risk because they think someone else will pay the price, the entire system becomes fragile. By the time the cracks appeared, it was too late. The culture of risk-taking without consequences had already hollowed out the financial system from within. It was not just a housing bubble. It was a moral bubble, a widespread belief that actions would be separated from outcomes. And when that illusion shattered, it revealed just how deep the damage went. But the real tragedy? It was not just Wall Street or big investors who paid the price. It was much more personal, much more painful. Let's move forward and see who really bore the weight of this collapse. When the dust settled, the headlines focused on big banks, lost fortunes, and government bailouts. But the real victims of the collapse? They were the everyday people, the ones who had the least power to protect themselves. Families who had scraped together everything they had to buy a modest home found themselves crushed under mortgage payments they could no longer afford. Communities that had once been vibrant, especially low-income and minority neighborhoods, were gutted by waves of foreclosures. Entire blocks became ghost towns almost overnight, lined with abandoned, crumbling homes. Many of the people hurt the most had never even fully understood the risks they were taking. They had been told, over and over, that home ownership was a guaranteed path to prosperity. They trusted banks, they trusted government programs, and they trusted that the system was built to help them, not to hurt them. But when the system itself was built on faulty incentives, on distorted signals, and on promises disconnected from reality, those at the bottom had the least margin for error, and they paid the highest price. It is one of the most painful ironies of the crisis. The interventions that were supposed to make housing more accessible and more stable ended up inflicting the greatest harm on those they were meant to help. And that leaves us with one final, critical set of questions, ones that go far beyond just housing, and into the very heart of how societies succeed or fail. Let's move to our final reflections. So what can we take away from all of this? At its core, the history of housing in America is not just a story about homes, mortgages, or banks. It is a story about freedom, about signals, and about what happens when well-intentioned interventions disrupt the natural flows that allow human flourishing to occur. When individuals are free to act, prices are free to speak. Supply meets demand. Innovation happens. Risk is priced honestly. In that kind of system, the rewards and consequences of decisions stay connected, pushing people to act carefully, creatively, and responsibly. But when centralized policies step in and try to manipulate outcomes, whether through price controls, subsidies, mandates, or guarantees, they do not eliminate problems. They simply bury them, allowing them to grow into bigger crises down the road. The real tragedy is that so much of the suffering we have discussed was avoidable. When you override market signals, you are not helping people in the long run, you are setting them up for pain when reality finally forces its way back in. Housing is not just a commodity, it is a human need, and the best way to meet that need is not by controlling markets from above, but by empowering individuals to build, to invest, to create, and to live freely. Thank you for joining us today on Truth Behind History. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden forces that shaped our world, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you are hungry for more thoughtful, entertaining history content, check out the other videos on our channel. We have a lot more stories to tell, and trust me, the truths we uncover are just getting started.